Haydi bakalım. Aşk ile!
The Ottoman Empire was pretty good at wiping out other civilizations. While European knights were still arguing over whose family crest had the most lions, the Ottomans had already mastered gunpowder warfare, elite military training, and psychological dominance. And at the heart of it all, the Janissaries, kidnapped Christians who were trained, brainwashed, and then unleashed as the world's first professional standing army. They were unstoppable in battle, feared across continents, and absolutely terrible at knowing when to quit. For hundreds of years, they built the empire. Then, when they got too much power, they practically held it hostage. Their story isn't just about military dominance. It's about what happens when your elite warriors get a little too comfortable. Give an army too much power, and pretty soon they're not just fighting for the empire, they're fighting to own it. The Ottoman Empire needed soldiers who wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't question orders, and wouldn't have pesky loyalties to anyone but the Sultan. Their solution? Take Christian boys from the Balkans, remove them from their families, and turn them into the most disciplined and lethal army in the world. Through the Devshirme system, Ottoman officers roamed conquered territory, selecting the strongest and brightest children, chosen for their potential to become warriors, officials, or even grand viziers. Once taken, their past lives were erased. They converted to Islam, changed their names, and were forbidden from marrying or owning property. Their only family was their regiment. Their only future was war. The Ottomans drilled them relentlessly, pushing them through brutal physical training and strict discipline. While European knights spent most of their time squabbling over land or sulking in castles, Janissaries trained for hours every day. They mastered archery, swordplay, and later gunpowder weapons, one of the first armies in the world to do so effectively. Unlike feudal armies, which relied on part-time warriors who would rather be farming, the Janissaries were full-time professional soldiers. They answered directly to the Sultan, fought in tightly coordinated units, and were conditioned to endure extreme hardship. Running from battle wasn't an option. If they lost the fight, they didn't go home alone. They died where they stood. That kind of commitment had an effect. Entire cities surrendered at the mere rumor that Janissaries were coming. So the Janissaries were well trained, and their arsenal? It was terrifying. At a time when European knights still believed in charging into battle with nothing but swords and a prayer, the Janissaries were firing gunpowder weapons with deadly precision. Their matchlock muskets cut through enemy lines, before most armies even knew what a firearm was. If that wasn't enough, they carried blunderbusses, massive shotguns that could turn a battlefield into a scene from a horror story. And when the fighting got up close and personal, out came the Killage, a viciously curved saber perfect for slicing through armor. But they weren't just about gunfire and steel. The Janissaries also carried bows, javelins, and war axes, making them lethal at every range. If you thought you could outmaneuver them on horseback, they would introduce you to the yataghan, a short, curved sword designed specifically for gutting cavalrymen out of their saddles. And if you somehow survived all of that, congratulations, you got to deal with their giant two-handed polearms, like the Teber war axe or the Harba spear, which could punch through armor like it was paper. And then there was the psychological warfare. The Janissaries announced their arrival in the most terrifying way possible. Marching under massive banners and wearing distinctive white hats, they played Metter music, the oldest known military marching band in history. The sound of their giant war drums called kuss, deafening horns known as zurna, and crashing cymbals, zeal, would shake the battlefield, before a blade or a blunderbuss was ever drawn. The Janissaries were some of the most disciplined soldiers in history, but they were also completely obsessed with cooking pots. Not just because they needed to eat, which obviously they did, but because their giant cauldron symbolized their unity, their loyalty, and if you were the Sultan, your worst nightmare. If the Janissaries were happy, the pot stood upright, meals were cooked, and all was well. If they flipped the pot over, that meant they were in open revolt. Things were about to get ugly. The Ottoman sultans hired the Janissaries to fight their wars, not overthrow their government, but somewhere along the way, the empire's most elite fighting force figured out that a big axe and a bigger paycheck gave them some serious influence. At first, Janissaries weren't supposed to care about money. They were supposed to live simple, disciplined lives and dedicate themselves fully to the empire. That worked for about 5 minutes. Unlike most armies at the time, the Janissaries got an actual salary. That might not sound revolutionary, but in an era when most soldiers were lucky to get a handful of stolen loot and an extra ration of bread, it made the Janissaries the best paid warriors in the world. On top of that, they had pensions and bonuses and medical care. Compare that to the average Ottoman citizen who had none of those things, and it's not hard to see why being a Janissary was one of the best gigs in town. They were also banned from marrying because what better way to keep an army focused than to make sure they had nothing else in their lives? But as the centuries passed, this rule fell apart. Wealthy Janissaries bought land, married into powerful families, and started forming their own political class. Eventually, they started ignoring orders, resisting reforms, and demanding more power. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were kingmakers. And that's where things got dangerous, not for them, but for the empire. Because an army that controls who sits on the throne is bad news for any sultan who wants to rule without worrying about getting strangled in his sleep. Sultan Osman II learned this the hard way. In 1622, he made the bold decision to reform the Janissaries, which in Ottoman politics meant cutting their pay and reducing their power. Osman thought this would make his army more efficient. The Janissaries thought this meant he needed to die. They mutinied, stormed the palace, and dragged Osman from his throne and strangled him to death. It was the first time they had outright taken the life of a sultan, but it wouldn't be the last. After that, they weren't really soldiers anymore. The Janissaries became kingmakers. They decided who sat on the throne, and more importantly, who did not. If they liked a sultan, they let him rule. If they didn't, good luck surviving the week. By the 17th and 18th centuries, they weren't even the same elite force they had once been. The whole system of recruiting young Christian boys from the Devshirme was abandoned. Instead, Ottoman citizens bought their way in, turning the Janissaries into a bloated, corrupt mess. These were not elite warriors anymore. They were glorified government employees. They ran businesses, collected bribes, and spent more time in the marketplace than on the battlefield. Some never even picked up a weapon, but they still cashed their paychecks. And when the Sultan tried to take away their perks, rebellion. The Janissaries had started as the empire's greatest weapon, but by the 18th century, they had become its biggest liability. The Ottoman army was rotting from the inside, and everyone knew it, except the Janissaries themselves. They were too busy counting their money. What's more, European armies were modernizing, developing better guns, better formations, and better tactics. The Ottomans? Yeah, not so much. The empire desperately needed to update its military, but the Janissaries were not having it. They resisted new weapons, refused to adopt new battlefield strategies, and clung to their old ways like a drunk uncle refusing to use GPS. Muskets? Cannons? More organized formations? No thanks. They were sticking with what worked in the 1500s, even as the rest of the world was upgrading. By the early 19th century, the Janissaries had devolved into a mob. They still had power, but they were more like a military mafia than an actual fighting force. They ran businesses, collected taxes, and made sure no one threatened their cushy lifestyle. That's when Sultan Mahmud II decided he was done with them. Unlike previous rulers, he had a plan. Instead of challenging the Janissaries outright, he set a trap. In 1826, he announced the formation of a new modern army that would follow European military standards. The Janissaries predictably lost their minds. They did what they always did when they were upset. They marched to the palace to demand change. But this time, they walked straight into their own funeral. Mahmud had cannons waiting for them. As soon as the Janissaries assembled, he ordered his artillery to open fire. Thousands were taken out on the spot. The survivors tried to flee but were hunted down, executed, or exiled. Those who surrendered were forcibly disbanded. The Janissaries were no more. The elite corps that had once built an empire had ended in fire and blood. They had been unstoppable warriors, terrifying enemies, and in the end, their own worst enemy. The Janissaries were one of history's greatest fighting forces until they were not. They went from elite warriors to a bureaucratic mess, from battlefield legends to a glorified protection racket. For centuries, they crushed enemies and expanded the Ottoman Empire. Then they got comfortable, they got greedy, and they started strangling sultans instead of fighting wars. Their story is what I'd call a cautionary tale. Giving your best soldiers too much power might seem like a good idea until they start overthrowing rulers, ignoring orders, and treating the empire like their personal retirement plan. Thanks for watching Nutty Productions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. What other warrior cultures would you like to hear about? Let me know below, and I'll see you next time.